your heart rates can go. But under normal circumstances where they don't have that present,
so this is the average person.
Yeah,
Okay.
Anthony?
I was saying, can you repeat that? You said when you deviate from the regular
When you're dependent on the AV node or another, and it can be other areas of the heart also, it's just very uncommon. The most common would be coming from the AV node. When you're dependent on the AV node, setting the pace of the heart, it keeps it at about 40 to 50 beats per minute. We're now decreasing the flow of blood to the tissues, which means I am now depriving the cells of, first of all, nutrients they need and getting rid of the waste. Yes, very much. You're not getting the energy and the movement or anything. So that usually is very quickly identified. And like I said, people have to begin to make decisions on what to do. If the pace stays below 40, that means usually something else in the heart is trying to make it beat, not very efficient at all. They usually go do other tests to, see what might be wrong. And then they have to put in the pacemaker. Pacemakers are, depending upon how you look at them, pacemakers are either beneficial or they can be problematic, but that just depends. So, in this rhythm that gets created, up to this point, the potentials that we have discussed, we've noticed that, like, with the skeletal muscle, where you have your resting membrane potential, you get your action potential, you get that depolarization, the repolarization. You can end up in, the skeletal muscle, for example, based on the impulse that's coming in. You can have a strong muscle contraction. You can have a weak muscle contraction. You can get a sustained muscle contraction. You guys remember all that from the muscles? Okay? Our heart needs to stay in a normal rhythm. It can't withstand a constant signal and going into tetanus. It can't withstand that. All right? So, we don't have what we typically call a stable resting membrane potential in that SA node. In that SA node, we kind of see that we get a gradual depolarization, all right, making it less negative, all right, making it more positive. And really, the movement of the ions for my SA node. Note, I am only referring to the SA node itself, okay? In that SA node, the pacemaker, movement of ions, we get a slow movement of sodium to come in, and then the potassium's not really compensating for it. The reason the SA node, when it fires, has just tiny bits of delay. Because when it fires, impulse has to go to the left atria, and we have to move down to the bundle of His, which they call it something else now. We'll get to the slide. I will always call it the bundle of His. All right? So, therefore, having a slow movement allows for Just when I say a tiny delay, I mean very tiny, milliseconds. Can any of y'all count in milliseconds? I can't. All right, I can't even really comprehend them. So when we're looking at this SA node, we end up having the situation where we have to make sure that we do get some type of recovery between impulses. Do you remember, like with the nerves and the muscle, you didn't have to have like 100% recovery every time? Like that's why in the muscle you could get tetanus, a constant contraction. Does everybody remember that? Okay. Now, because first of all, skeletal muscle can work under anaerobic conditions. The heart cannot. The heart has to work aerobically. The cells of the heart, their mitochondria are huge because they require the oxygen and the use of the mitochondria. Deprive the heart of oxygen, it's going to stop. So it can't work without oxygen. So it has to have that ability in between impulses to do some recovery. So in that pacemaker, you guys remember how when we talk about the ions across a membrane, that when you look at a cell, inside tends to always be negative, and outside are where we find all of our positives, like this, for example, sodium, calcium. Does everybody remember that? And because of the structures and proteins and other stuff like that on the inside of a cell, they tend to be negative. And when an action potential occurs, what happens to the movement of the ions? We're going to see positive flow in, turning the interior more positive. Does everybody remember that? This was called my depolarization. Yes, no, maybe. Same thing is happening in the tissues of the heart. I'm dependent on calciums, sodiums, being able to move in at the time of the impulse, potassiums moving out, okay? I am dependent on a depolarization, the point at which the heart would be, the node would fire, getting my repolarization, having my little bit of rest, and starting the process all over again. Does that make sense? Why is this clinically significant? In the case, all right, wait a minute, repeat that one more.
You can monitor the electrical impulses to see if the heart's actually beating.
I can monitor EKG. Heard that? Okay. If electrolytes are out of balance, could that affect heart rate? Most definitely. Just like electrolytes not being in balance can affect skeletal muscle. It can affect cardiac. And guess what? What's the third type of muscle tissue in our body? Smooth. Now, how can this be clinically significant? Somebody comes in, irregular heartbeat, muscles might be sluggish or overactive. He's immediately taken me to situations. Okay, so they could be dehydrated, all right? But how are they going to figure that out?
Give them some water and see what happens.
Well, let's say that if they're taking like to the emergency room stuff, let's say they're going to draw some blood. And then they'll start the IV and take it from there. Do a?
Lactated bringers.
Yes. All right, lots of things we can do. Now, if it's dehydration, for example, hopefully rehydration solves the problem. Okay? However, there can be situations, especially in aging adults, where this is a chronic problem. Okay? And therefore, they end up with lots of different cardiac issues that they have to deal with. All right? So, it doesn't necessarily have to be just aging individuals, because people can have electrolyte imbalances from birth.
So what is the pacemaker potential, like, defined?
The pacemaker potential defined?
Yeah. It's one of the questions on the study guide. What is pacemaker potential?
What is the pacemaker potential is going to be roughly, they put it at roughly -40, even though that number doesn't have to stay stable. So you would end up having basically -40 up to just a tad bit over. Okay, sometimes it could be about to 10. So this would be my pacemaker potential. Resting membrane, roughly at -40. Potential, about 5 to 7 on the positive side. So when we begin that firing of the SA node, and once that SA node fires and it travels to the atria, my atria now contract. Now let's take a peek at this for a second. My atrium, my ventricles. Okay, is everybody following me? So, SA node fires, and these atria contract. Because it takes a second, or not a second, because it takes a millisecond, okay? We're going to have just a little bit of a delay between the right and the left atria. And then, as the signal reaches my AV node, it now slows down. What? All right, let me think here for a second. In a minute, I have 60 seconds, and on average, 75 beats per minute. I'm not even getting a second per beat. Does that make sense? Or a beat per second. It's less than a second. These actions that are occurring, literally milliseconds. Milli. So, it slows down because The gap junction